They warned us never to participate in experimental drug trials without reading the fine print. But desperation blinds. Faster than any substance ever could. What I swallowed that morning didn't just alter my mind. It trapped me in a prison where seconds became lifetimes, and the simple act of blinking cost me decades. This is my confession, typed across what feels like centuries, a plea from someone who has lived longer than any human soul was meant to endure. Asterisk, welcome to nightmare reality, where the boundaries between consciousness and terror dissolve, and the human mind becomes its own worst enemy. Tonight's story will take you to a place where time itself becomes the monster. Asterisk. My name doesn't matter anymore, because by the time you hear this, I will have lived so many lifetimes that the person I was this morning has been buried under millennia of experience. But I'll tell you who I used to be, back when time moved at a normal pace. Back when a minute was just 60 seconds and not an eternity of suffering. I was a graduate student, drowning in debt, working part-time jobs that barely covered rent, and supplementing my income by volunteering for medical research studies. You know the type, healthy subject trials, where pharmaceutical companies test experimental drugs on people like me to assess side effects. Before moving to clinical trials with actual patients, the pay was decent. The risks seemed minimal, and I'd done it a dozen times before without incident. Kidney function drugs, blood pressure medications, cholesterol pills. None of them ever did anything remarkable. Maybe I always ended up in the placebo groups, or maybe the drugs just worked silently in the background, but I never felt different, never experienced anything unusual. Asterisk, that all changed at 10:15 this morning. Though morning feels like it happened in another geological age, in another universe entirely. I arrived at the research facility in downtown DC, signed the usual consent forms without reading them too carefully, and met with the research assistant, a young woman with kind eyes and a clipboard. She explained that today's trial involved a psychoactive compound designed to enhance cognitive processing speed. The drug was intended to help patients with traumatic brain injuries, people whose mental faculties had slowed due to damage, people who struggled to think clearly or react quickly. The compound, she said, would temporarily accelerate neural firing patterns, speeding up the brain's ability to process information. It sounded fascinating in an academic way, like something out of a science fiction novel. But I didn't think much about the practical implications. She handed me a small white pill and a cup of water, and I swallowed it without ceremony. Asterisk, she told me to wait in the lobby for about 30 minutes while the drug took effect. Then they'd bring me back for a battery of tests. I settled onto a worn leather couch in the waiting room, surrounded by the typical medical office decor. Dull generic landscape paintings, a few potted plants that looked half dead, and a coffee table covered in outdated magazines. I picked up a copy of Psychology Today and started reading an article about the neuroscience of habit formation. The words flowed easily, the concepts clicking into place with unusual clarity. But I attributed that to being well rested, rather than any pharmaceutical intervention. I finished the article and moved on to another, then another, working my way through the entire magazine with what felt like casual ease. When I set it down and reached for a copy of US News and World Report, I was surprised to find myself genuinely interested in the economic policy discussions, topics that would normally have bored me to tears. I devoured the magazine, absorbing every graph and statistic, every nuanced argument about fiscal policy and international trade. Then I picked up a Scientific American and read a dense article about quantum computing that would normally have required multiple readings to comprehend. This time, the concepts felt intuitive, obvious even, like I was reading about basic arithmetic, rather than cutting-edge physics. Asterisk, something was definitely happening, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what felt different. My thoughts seemed sharper, more organized, but the waiting room itself had taken on a strange quality, like I was watching everything through a camera, with the frame rate turned way down. I looked up at the wall clock, expecting to see that 45 minutes or an hour had passed, that I'd gotten so absorbed in reading that I'd lost track of time. The clock read 10:23, 8 minutes. I had consumed 3 full magazines, hundreds of pages of dense material, in just 8 minutes. My heart rate should have spiked with realization, with the understanding that something profound was happening to my brain. But even that physiological response seemed to occur in slow motion, a gradual awareness of my pulse climbing, rather than a sudden jolt of adrenaline. Asterisk, I stood up from the couch, intending to walk to the bookshelf on the far wall where I'd noticed some donated hardcovers earlier. The act of standing, which should have taken perhaps 2 seconds, seemed to stretch out into an interminable process. My muscles responded to my commands, but with agonizing slowness, like I was moving through invisible molasses. I pushed against the couch with my hands, felt my weight shifting forward with glacial patience. Felt my legs straightening beneath me with all the speed of tectonic plates grinding together. By the time I was fully upright, what felt like a full minute had elapsed. Though some distant rational part of my mind understood that only a fraction of a second had actually passed. Walking was even worse. Each step required careful coordination, a conscious effort to lift my foot, swing it forward, and plant it on the ground. All while my brain screamed with impatience at how long each movement took. 2 steps to the bookshelf felt like crossing a desert. Asterisk, I scanned the spines of the books, my eyes moving across titles with lightning speed, even as my hand drifted toward the shelf with the urgency of a glacier. I selected Moby Dick, a book I'd always meant to read, but never had the patience for, and watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as my fingers closed around it over the course of what seemed like several seconds. The return journey to the couch was another epoch, another geological age of waiting for my body to catch up with my mind. When I finally collapsed back onto the leather cushions, I fell in slow motion, my descent gentle and dreamlike, as if gravity itself had weakened. I knew, intellectually, that I must have fallen at the normal rate, but my perception had warped so dramatically that even a quick drop felt like floating. Asterisk, I opened Moby Dick and began to read, starting with those famous words, "Call me Ishmael," and continuing through the opening chapters with voracious speed. The language was dense, the sentences long and winding, but I absorbed them effortlessly, picturing the whaling ships and the obsessed captain with perfect clarity. I read about Quickwag and the Pequod, about the white whale and Ahab's consuming vendetta, devouring chapter after chapter with the casual ease of someone skimming a grocery list. Before I knew it, I'd reached the scene where Ahab throws his pipe into the sea, declaring that smoking no longer brings him pleasure, that nothing matters except his revenge against Moby Dick. That was chapter 30. 30 chapters of one of literature's most challenging novels, and it had felt like light recreational reading. Asterisk, the research assistant finally called my name, and I turned toward her voice with my new trademark slowness, my neck rotating through what felt like thick honey. She smiled at me, her expression frozen in place for what seemed like several seconds before her lips completed their upward curve, and gestured for me to follow her back to the testing area. Walking down the hallway behind her was an exercise in patience, watching her legs move in extreme slow motion, watching her arms swing back and forth like a pendulum with a 10-second period. When we reached the exam room, she asked me how I was feeling, her words emerging as a low, drawn-out rumble that I had to concentrate to pass into syllables and meaning. Asterisk, I told her I felt slow, that everything seemed to be moving through water, and she laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling across hills. She explained that it was the opposite, that I wasn't slow at all, that my brain was running at 10 or 20 times its normal processing speed, maybe more, and that my body only seemed sluggish because my perception had accelerated so dramatically. She pantomimed running in place, her movements a jerky slow-motion demonstration, and explained that my muscles were actually responding faster than normal, that I was moving with enhanced speed. But my supercharged brain perceived even these accelerated movements as painfully slow. The disconnect between mental and physical speed was absolute and profound. Asterisk, they ran me through a series of tests that confirmed what I already suspected. My cognitive processing had entered the realm of the superhuman. They tossed 3 balls at me and told me to juggle, and I did so easily, watching each ball arc through the air with plenty of time to position my hands beneath it. They added a 4th ball, then a 5th, then 6, and I kept them all aloft without difficulty, though the task was almost boring, watching each ball crawl through its lazy parabola while I waited with my hands in position. They threw Cheerios into the air, and I plucked them from their trajectories with chopsticks, watching the little cereal rings drift upward and then down like dandelion seeds on a windless day. They dropped a handful of mixed coins, and I counted the total value, $2.37, before they clinked against the floor. They showed me rapid-fire slideshows, 10 images per second, and I had no trouble describing each picture in detail, from the color of the car in image 3 to the breed of dog in image 7. The cognitive tests were equally remarkable. They gave me word search puzzles that should have taken 5 or 10 minutes to complete, and I finished them in what they said was 3 seconds. Though to me it felt like a leisurely 20 minutes of scanning the letter grid and circling words. They showed me complex mazes printed on poster-sized paper, intricate tangles of paths and dead ends, and I traced the solution with my finger in what they measured as 2 seconds. They administered IQ tests and reaction time assessments and memory evaluations, and in every case, I performed far beyond the normal human range. The research assistant showed me my score on something called the No-PF scale, 253. She explained that anything over 100 was considered enhanced. Anything over 150 was in the genius range, and anything above 200 was essentially superhuman. My brain was processing reality at a rate that shouldn't have been biologically possible. Then, they sent me home. That's what still haunts me. The casual way they dismissed me, told me the effects would wear off in a few hours, advised me to use my enhanced cognition to catch up on work emails or finish projects I'd been putting off. A few hours in real time, they said, would feel like a few days to me, but it would pass. And I should just try to stay productive and comfortable until my brain returned to normal. They had no idea what they'd done to me. They had no idea that the drug was still intensifying, that my perception of time was still accelerating, that those few hours would become an eternity of suffering, beyond anything the human mind was meant to endure. The metro ride home was my first taste of true horror. 3 stops on the Red Line, a journey that normally took about 35 minutes, stretched into what felt like several days of mind-numbing tedium. Just walking out of the medical building and navigating to the elevator felt like it consumed an hour of my subjective time, my legs pumping as fast as I could make them move, while the hallway crawled past me at a snail's pace. I tried sprinting, throwing all my mental effort into commanding my muscles to move faster, but the laws of biomechanics held me prisoner just as effectively as steel chains. My brain could process information at superhuman speed, but my muscles and tendons and bones operated according to the same old rules of physics. I was a Formula One race car engine installed in a bicycle. All that power with nowhere to go. The disconnect made me clumsy in ways I'd never experienced before. I misjudged distances and velocities, unable to properly calibrate how fast I was moving relative to the stationary world around me. I sprinted toward the elevator and meant to slow down gracefully, to extend my finger and tap the call button with casual precision. But instead, I plowed into the wall at full speed, my finger jabbing into the plaster with enough force to bend it backward. The pain was immediate and intense, and it didn't fade the way pain normally does. Didn't diminish to a dull ache after 30 seconds or a minute. Instead, because my perception of time had become so distorted, that acute stabbing sensation seemed to last for 30 minutes, for 45 minutes. A sustained agony that made me gasp and clutch my hand to my chest. By the time the pain finally began to ebb, the elevator had arrived and I stumbled inside, cradling my throbbing finger. The elevator descent was psychological torture of a different kind. Nothing to look at except brushed metal walls and my own reflection. Nothing to hear except the faint mechanical hum of the car's descent. Nothing to do except wait as 7 floors took what felt like 4 or 5 hours to traverse. I paced back and forth in the tiny space, my movements dreamlike and floaty, and tried not to think about how much worse this would get before it got better. If 3 metro stops were going to feel like days, and the drug's effects weren't scheduled to wear off for several hours, I was facing what would subjectively feel like a week or more of this nightmare. A week trapped in a body that moved through cold honey, in a world where sound had become barely audible, where every second stretched into an eternity. When the elevator doors finally groaned open, I burst out into the lobby and sprinted toward the metro station. Despite my earlier clumsiness, I was starting to adapt to my new condition, learning to anticipate how long each movement would take, how to adjust my trajectory and velocity to account for my superhuman reaction time. I danced down the sidewalk, weaving between pedestrians who seemed to be standing still, dodging past cars that crept through intersections like they were parked. It felt almost exhilarating, this newfound ability to perceive and react to obstacles with such precision, to thread through gaps that would normally require split-second timing, but now felt leisurely and obvious. I bounded down the metro station stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my feet finding purchase with absolute confidence, even as I moved faster than I'd ever moved before. The metro platform was crowded with evening commuters, and I spent what felt like an hour working my way through the press of bodies to find a spot near the edge. The arrival board said the next train would arrive in 6 minutes, and I nearly wept at the prospect of standing there, staring at the tracks, for what would feel like hours of subjective time. There was nothing to read, nothing to focus on except the curved tunnel and the advertisement posters on the opposite wall. I tried counting the tiles on the wall, tried composing poetry in my mind, tried anything to distract myself from the crushing, relentless boredom of waiting. 6 minutes, 6 hours of my life, vanished into the void, sacrificed to the tyranny of accelerated perception. When the train finally arrived, it came screaming into the station with its brakes squealing, but to my ears, The sound had been frequency shifted down into the bass register. A long, low moan, like a foghorn or a whale song. All sounds had been affected this way. High-pitched noises slowed and deepened. Voices dropped below the threshold of my hearing entirely. The world rendered effectively silent, except for the lowest rumbles and roars. A baby was crying somewhere on the platform, and I could just barely hear it. A mournful keening, like a whale calling across empty ocean. The train's brakes were a sustained tuba note that seemed to last forever. Everything else was silence, profound and absolute, the kind of quiet you might experience in deep space or at the bottom of the ocean. I boarded the train and found a seat, settling in for what I knew would be another subjective eternity of waiting. The train lurched forward with glacial slowness, creeping out of the station like it was pulling against some invisible resistance. I watched the tunnel walls slide past the windows, watched the lights flicker by one, watched the other passengers sit frozen in their seats like mannequins. The crying baby's wail song continued, rising and falling with slow waves of distress. Somewhere in the car, someone passed gas, and the smell hit me with full intensity. My sense of smell hadn't been affected by the drug, which meant I got to enjoy every disgusting odor in real time. Even as sound and sight had been warped beyond recognition. Body odor, brake dust, someone's fast food lunch. The general funk of too many humans crammed into an enclosed space. All of it assaulted my nostrils without mercy. 3 stops, days of my life. Days spent sitting on a metro train, breathing in other people's stink, listening to a baby's slow down crying, staring at the same collection of bored faces and smartphone screens. By the time I stumbled off at my stop, I felt like I'd aged a decade. Like I'd spent a significant portion of my life trapped in that metal tube hurtling through darkness. I ran through the station and up the stairs, bursting into daylight that seemed blindingly bright, even though it was late afternoon, and sprinted the 3 blocks to my apartment building, with my arms pumping and my lungs burning and my legs screaming for rest. Getting inside my apartment was almost a relief, a return to a familiar environment, where I at least had options, had things I could do to pass the time. I grabbed a book from my nightstand, 100 Years of Solitude, which I'd been working through slowly for the past month, and tore through it in what must have been 3 minutes of real time, but felt like several pleasant hours of reading. The magical realism of Marquez's prose seemed somehow fitting given my current state. The way time folded in on itself in the novel, mirroring my own distorted perception. I finished the book and set it aside, then checked the clock. 3 minutes had passed, 3 minutes apiece. 3 minutes of distraction, and now I was back to confronting the horrifying reality of my situation. I tried the internet next, booting up my laptop and wading through the eternal process of startup and connection. Loading a single web page took what felt like hours. Literal hours of watching the progress bar creep across the screen, and then I'd read the entire article in a fraction of a second, and have to endure another hours-long wait for the next page to load. I managed to get through about 100 news articles before I gave up in frustration, each one adding perhaps 30 seconds to the real-world clock, while consuming what felt like extended periods of my subjective life. The math was beginning to sink in, the terrible arithmetic of my situation becoming clear. If every real second felt like minutes or hours to me, and if the drug wasn't going to wear off for several more hours, I was facing what would subjectively feel like weeks or months of this torture. I grabbed more books from my shelf and read them cover to cover. 4 more minutes gone. I tried to sleep, thinking that maybe I could just shut down my consciousness and wait out the drug's effects in blissful unconsciousness. But my body wasn't tired. My physical brain thought it was still mid-afternoon, thought I'd only been awake for a normal amount of time, and refused to cooperate with my desire for oblivion. I lay in bed with my eyes closed for what felt like hours and hours, trying to will myself into sleep, but it wouldn't come. My mind just kept racing, kept thinking and processing, and experiencing every eternal second of WAKEFULNESS. On desperation, I went to my medicine cabinet and found a bottle of Ambien, a sleeping pill I'd gotten prescribed months ago for occasional insomnia. I swallowed one with a handful of water, feeling the pill slide down my throat in an extended, nauseating lump that took forever to descend. Then I went back to reading, burning through 2 volumes of Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, books I would normally have found dense and difficult, but which now seemed straightforward, almost simplistic. 35 minutes had passed since I took the Ambien. I lay down on the couch, closed my eyes, and waited for drowsiness to overtake me. Instead, something far worse happened. The Ambien didn't make me sleepy. The Ambien interacted with the experimental drug in a way that intensified its effects 100-fold. 1,000-fold, beyond anything the researchers could have predicted. I was lying on my couch one moment, and the next moment the world stopped entirely. All sound ceased. My perception of time, already massively slowed, dropped into a range that defied comprehension. Before the ambient, each real second had felt like minutes or maybe an hour of subjective time. After the ambient took hold, each real second became days. Days, an entire rotation of the Earth. 24 hours of subjective experience, compressed into a single tick of the clock. I panicked and tried to stand up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The disconnect between my mind and my muscles had become so extreme that voluntary movement was essentially impossible. I willed my arm to move and watched it shift a fraction of an inch over the course of what felt like hours. I commanded my legs to stand and felt them tensing with the speed of countenance drifting. I was trapped, locked inside a body that had become a prison. My superhuman mind screaming for action, while my flesh and bones responded with geological patience. I managed to roll off the couch after what felt like a week of effort, tumbling to the floor in a slow-motion fall that gave me plenty of time to try to position myself for a safe landing. I still wasn't prepared for the pain when I hit. My shoulder took the impact, and I felt it building gradually. A pressure that grew and grew over the course of hours, until something inside finally gave way with a sickening pop. My shoulder dislocated, and the agony was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not because it was more intense than other injuries, but because it lasted so impossibly long. The acute pain of dislocation normally fades within a minute or two, but for me it continued for hours and hours and hours. A sustained scream of nerve signals flooding into my brain without pause or mercy. I knew I needed help. I knew I had to get back to the research facility. Had to find the people who'd done this to me, and make them understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. I crawled across my apartment floor, a journey that took what felt like days, and eventually made it out into the hallway, down the stairs, and onto the street. Crawling was the only option because walking required too much coordination, too much ability to judge timing and distance. Abilities that had been stripped away by my warped perception. I crawled down the sidewalk while pedestrians stepped around, me with expressions of shock and concern frozen on their faces for extended periods. I crawled into the metro station, under the turnstile, onto the escalator that descended with the speed of erosion. The escalator dumped me onto the platform. After what felt like months of slowly descending, the crowd was thick, the evening rush hour in full swing. And I crawled through a forest of legs and rolling suitcases until I reached a concrete bench near the edge of the platform. The train arrival board said 20 minutes until the next train. 20 minutes, a year of my life. An entire year that I would spend lying on this cold floor, staring up at the curved ceiling, drowning in pain and boredom and despair. I curled up next to the bench, trying to find a position that would ease the screaming agony in my dislocated shoulder. Then the drug interaction got worse, impossibly worse, entering a new phase that pushed my perception into realms that shouldn't exist. I blinked, just a normal reflexive blink, the kind of thing you do without thinking dozens of times per minute. My eyelids began to close, descending across my field of vision with the speed of a sunset, taking what felt like weeks to complete their journey. Weeks of slowly increasing darkness, weeks of my world narrowing to a slit of light and then vanishing entirely. And when my eyes were fully closed, when I sat in complete darkness with the pain of my shoulder as my only sensory input, my mind didn't just sit idle. My brain began to hallucinate, with no external stimulus to process. My hyperaxylated consciousness turned inward and began generating its own reality. I heard voices singing in languages that didn't exist, saw colors and patterns that had no names, felt textures that weren't there. I relived my entire childhood in what felt like real time, every moment from birth to the present day, scrolling past with perfect clarity. Then I imagined living another life, a different person in a different time, experiencing decades of fictional existence in the darkness behind my eyelids. I forgot who I was. I forgot where I was. The concept of English evaporated from my mind, replaced by invented languages that made perfect sense within the logic of my hallucinations. I spoke to God, argued with God, became God, created and destroyed entire universes with my thoughts. Time lost all meaning because time had already been destroyed, stretched so thin that it ceased to function as a useful concept. My eyes finally opened, a process that took weeks of slowly increasing light, weeks of my eyelids grinding upward with the patience of geological formation. When they were fully open, I had a narrow view of the metro platform, ankles and shoes of commuters standing near me, the edge of the concrete bench above my head, an advertisement on the far wall that I came to know with absolute intimacy. Every pixel of that advertisement, every curve of every letter, every shade of color in the model's face. I knew it better than I knew my own childhood home, better than I knew my own face, because I stared at it for what felt like years. I managed to extract my phone from my pocket, a task that required decades of subjective time. Decades. Entire generations of humans could have been born, lived, and died in the time it took me to work my hand into my jeans pocket, close my fingers around the phone, and pull it free. But I eventually succeeded, and I used the last reserves of my coordination to open a browser and type out a message. A plea, a confession, working letter by letter through lifetimes of effort. This message, the one you're reading right now. I am older than any human has ever been, not in body, but in experience, in lived subjective time. I have spent hundreds of lifetimes curled up on this metro platform floor, staring at ankles and advertisements, drowning in pain and boredom so intense it has become a physical presence, a crushing weight that presses against my skull from the inside. I have thought every thought a human mind can think. I have imagined entire civilizations and watched them rise and fall. I have gone insane and returned to sanity more times than I can count. I have begged for death in every language, real and imagined. And I will continue to experience this until the drug wears off, which the researchers said would take a few hours, but to me will feel like centuries or millennia, or until someone ends it for me. That's why I'm posting this message. That's my plan B, my desperate hope. If you're reading this, if you're on the GLENMONT metro platform right now, please look for me. Please find the man curled up next to the bench near the red line tracks. Please understand that I am begging you to end my suffering. A bullet to the head, quick and clean, aimed downward through my temple so it destroys my hippocampus in the shortest possible distance. Even that death will seem to take decades from my perspective. Decades of agony as the bullet tears through my brain. But it will be finite. It will have an end. It will be mercy compared to the alternative. If no one helps me, I will eventually throw myself in front of the train. When it arrives after its year-long journey into the station, when I manage to crawl with decades of effort onto the tracks, when the tons of steel finally hit my body, I will experience being crushed and torn apart for what will feel like centuries of agony, before my brain finally dies and my consciousness ends. But even that seems preferable to staying here, to continuing this existence where every heartbeat is an epoch, where every breath is a geological age, where boredom and pain have merged into a single, unending scream that defines every moment of my awareness. This is my confession. This is my plea. This is the warning I wish I'd received before I swallowed that pill this morning. Back when morning was 10,000 years ago. Back when I was young and foolish and thought an experimental drug trial was just an easy way to make some extra money. Now I am ancient beyond measure. A consciousness that has endured more subjective time than human minds were ever meant to survive. Asterisk, I am still here. I am still waiting. And every second that passes is another day added to a sentence that was already longer than human civilization. Asterisk, the man on the GLENMONT platform hasn't moved in 37 minutes. Commuters step around him, some calling for security, others filming on their phones. His eyes are open, staring at the advertisement across the tracks. But he doesn't blink. Not yet. The train is arriving now, its brakes beginning their long squeal. From inside his frozen mind, trapped in a time that moves at speeds incomprehensible to ordinary consciousness, he can hear it coming. To him, the sound will continue for another year. To us, it's just another Monday evening on the metro. They say consciousness is the most powerful force in the universe, but they never told us it could become our most perfect prison.